Professor Novis, you teach an English course for our Bachelor's of Theology students. Can you tell us about the general structure of the course?
The course is for first-year bachelor students. That's divided into composition and literature. In the composition section, we do grammar, but also argumentation and a little bit of logic. And in the literature part, we read 4 books, each of them representing a different period in Western literary history. We start with Shakespeare and the Renaissance, and then go to Scarlet Letter with Romanticism, Picture of Dorian Gray on the borderline with modernity, and Waiting for Godot for postmodernity.
So can you give us the value of reading and analyzing literature?
Well, in general, it teaches especially younger learners, or at least those on the lower end of the college trajectory, to move their mind from particular individual things into more universal themes. Right, so instead of thinking about only what the characters are saying, right, you want to think about the higher levels of the meaning in the text. So in that case, it prepares the mind for philosophy by teaching it how to abstract through concrete examples. And specifically, the trajectory that we teach in seminary English class is supposed to follow the trajectory of Western society from the beginnings of modernity in the Renaissance almost to the end of modernity, which is postmodernity, and to the deflation of the original ideal of modernity, which is Waiting for Godot, because there is no hope. Right? There's just waiting for Godot forever. And in that, we trace, unfortunately, the decline of the West. Right? Each generation from the Renaissance to postmodernity has lost something essential that originally was characteristic of Western European sense of being. Right? We talk about the decline of the humanities content with the rise of mechanical sciences that was resisted by the Romantics for some kind of inner sense of authenticity. But eventually that dream was popped, and the Romantic resistance ultimately lost out to industrialization, leading to a lot of disillusionment in literature. Right? So through the literature, you could trace the trajectory of Western society as well.
So can you repeat for me the books that the students read?
Shakespeare, and that's the play King Lear. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. Oscar Wilde, Portrait of Dorian Gray. And Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot.
Can we do a brief review of each title and why it's important? I know you gave us an overarching structure, but getting into detail for each book would be nice. So you see what they represent, because they represent different, you said time periods and eras of Western civilization, of Western thought.
Yeah, and modern history, right? Starting with the Renaissance, it's the beginning of modernity. And that's King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, one of his tragedies, where a king ultimately goes insane when he loses power and no longer has access to all the freedoms that he once had as a monarch. So that shows in 2 directions. You could do the historical analysis, and that's the relationship between King James, who at that time was the King of England, and his idea of divine right of kings and how the king's supposed to rule the people and what makes up what constitutes a good king. And on the more theoretical or philosophical side, it represents the fall of pride. Right? Famously, hubris is one of the main themes of classic tragedy, and the consequences of not having an internal life and requiring external supports to justify your identity. And King Lear had no internal life when he lost everything. He also lost his mind because he had nothing stable to hold on to. Similarly, Scarlet Letter is, I think, important because it is a criticism of Western Christianity. So I frame it as what kind of Christian not to be in that sense, because it's the Puritans versus Hester Prynne, who is the main character. We do a little bit of feminism for Scarlet Letter because it's about women, female empowerment. We talk about the limits of that and the necessity of that for Western society, especially the way Western gender had been imposed upon both male and females in that culture, and the need for some kind of reform, and then comparing it to Orthodox gender roles. It's a work of from the Romantic period, so it's about rejecting artificial human constructions, returning to nature, attempting to integrate with the whole, and discovering an internal authenticity through that was deprived from society based on all these externals, be it empty dogma, or even Hawthorne is criticizing the rise of modern science and the rise of industrialization as well. All those are external forms with no content. So the Romantic period was trying to compensate for that by rejecting the empty form and rediscovering the content within themselves. Picture of Dorian Gray is interesting because it was written by Oscar Wilde, who was arrested for violating the lewdness laws of England in the turn of the century. And yet he's writing a book against, or at least showing the consequences of living a decadent lifestyle. And there's, again, a lot of modern presuppositions in it that we go through, right? Hedonism, the constant need for new pleasures that come out of that, and the eventual black hole of addiction that is the ultimate consequence of that kind of lifestyle. And the dangers of it. Right at the end of the portrait of Dorian Gray ends up dead. And then Waiting for Godot, right on the borderline with postmodernity. It's about two characters, homeless beggars. Not beggars. They actually have, in the play they emphasize they're too good to be beggars. They don't ask for money. They're just homeless wanderers. And they're hoping that a mysterious character, Godot, will appear to help them, get them out of their dead-end life. And the point of Waiting for Godot is there are two acts, and Godot never comes. Godot becomes a symbol of any kind of hope, but specifically God himself. So the theme, as with postmodernity, you're going nowhere. There's no there's no hope. There's no resolution. You're just waiting, floating in abeyance forever with no satisfaction and no resolution.
Can you characterize for me what modernity is, broadly speaking? Can contrast that with postmodernity? Because I feel like most people don't have a strong grasp of what postmodernity is.
Modernity begins in the 1500s. The end of the Renaissance is the beginning of modernity. There's a crossover. And it starts with the rise of modern science, which is not all bad. Right? Observing the world systematically and trying to use induction in order to determine the laws of nature through observation. Right? That becomes the foundation of the scientific method. And in and of itself, right, is not a problem. If it had a correct philosophical or theological framework, then you could understand the world in the light of God who created the world. But this scientific method with modernity tended not only to be an objective procedure, but also came with ideological baggage, such as the necessary raising of the past and the building of a future with no connection to that past. So modernity tends to be marked by an optimism of the future that believes in a perpetual progress, that the more science we do, the more we'll be able to transcend the past, transcend the superstitions and the ignorance of the past in order to build a utopian future, and one in which all human beings will be freed from the bondage to nature through technology. So modernity tended to have a very reactionary spirit, right, rejection of the past, but also a very optimistic view of the future, believing that if you got rid of all the superstitions, all the religions, all the philosophies, and only observed nature and tried to find laws in that manner, there would be utopia. However, that didn't happen, and the dream of postmodernity was deflated after the World Wars especially, but starting in the 1800s with the Romantics, they realized the limits of modernity, but especially World War I and World War II. It seemed that the steady progress of modernity and the steady rise of industrialization and technology didn't lead to the utopia that it promised, right? Didn't lead to all creature comforts met in the most efficient way possible. It didn't lead to safer working conditions or cheaper goods. It actually did the opposite. It led to an anti-human world, that all the technology was marshaled for weapons. The weapons were ultimately able to devastate Western Europe, right, during the World Wars, World War I and World War II. So postmodernity is a reaction to the premises of modernity that ultimately let them down after the wars. So the major difference is, instead of the hope of progress in the hope of utopia, postmodernity, and Waiting for Godot as an example, tends to be hopeless, tends to want to remove the linear view of history in order to be more realistic about the fact that society is not going anywhere and has never gone anywhere to begin with. That's why also they reject the scientific presuppositions of modernity, because where did it go? What did it lead them to? It didn't lead them to a human future, it led them to an inhuman future. And so in one sense, postmodernity is trying to view the world realistically through a lens that criticizes modern science for the sake of some kind of human future, even though, paradoxically or in a contradictory mode, they no longer believe in that future because it let them down so many times. And so, unfortunately, both sides tended to be atheist, the modern side and the postmodern side. So when the postmoderns rejected the modern presuppositions, continued their atheist undercurrents, they couldn't find a hope from within their system to be able to drive them to a new future. And instead, they just destroyed the old past in order to liberate potentials that ultimately have no true direction. It's about liberating your potentials in the moment while you're waiting for something to happen, but it never happens. So you just do what you can. In the meantime, try to pull out your little bit of joy in that nihilistic, absurd background.
That raises a big question, Professor. Maybe just where the postmodernism is going. Where does something like transhumanism fit in this model of modernity and then post-modernity? Because it seems like transhumanism, which is the raging ideology of, at the very least, the elites today, what would you consider that type of phenomenon in light of this? Because, you have people you have the two guys who are waiting for Godot, and then you got let's say, the mad scientist or maybe the tech elite, technocrat, in the building, right, that they're leaning against, trying to build his own technological messiah. Where does that fit into this framework?
Technocrats tend to be on the modern side of things, right? So the rise of modern science, the dependency on technology, the hope that technology is going to lead to a utopian future, right? That's all there. That's why Peter Thiel says that if you're against his AI, then you are ultimately the Antichrist, because according to him, God wants progress because humans are created in the image of God. So that's what we're supposed to do, is reverse engineer the world in order to create our own image and likeness as well, right? God created us in his image and likeness. We are in the image of God, so we also create something in our image and likeness, according to that twisted version of Christianity. And again, very modern, because part of the many characteristics of modernity is that you reduce the world to quantity, right, in order to fit it into the equations that then will be manipulated to mold the world into technology. So part of that mentality is efficiency, right, to minimize the quantity of certain things and maximize the quantity of others, right? You minimize the amount of time it takes to make something, you minimize the amount of workers it takes to make something, you minimize the amount of money you have to pay the workers, and you maximize the amount of goods that you create and the amount of profit you make. And all that is understood quantitatively, and that's one of the many reductions of the modern world that comes out of this modern science, right? Is that the world is ultimately quantitative. And that's actually one of the most important parts of the humanities, is that actually, if you believe that the world is only quantitative, you leave out the most important aspect of human existence, which is quality, right? Sometimes just doing things the fastest and making the most of something will not produce the highest quality goods, which is the case right now. Everybody knows that as time has gone on, even within our society, the quality of the commodities have gone down because of this raw reduction to profits and this quantitative mentality that drives it. So this AI obsession is a necessary correlate to the basic presuppositions of modernity, which are, again, reduction of true existence to what you can observe, the reduction of what you can observe, further reduction to quantity, arranging all the quantity into equations, using those equations to create technology, which then manipulates the world, ultimately to fulfill our passions, because they have no end goal other than that, right? To fulfill the human creature comforts, because there's no higher transcendent reality. Postmodernity tries to rebel against that in many ways, but also following their atheist presuppositions.
So, despite the name postmodernity, as opposed to it being a progression, like a single linear progression, would it be more apt to say that the postmodernists and postmodernity represents a type of schismatic movement from modernity? Because it seems as with postmodernity, modernity has not stopped, or at least the philosophy of modernity has not stopped. It's just there's people who schism from it and have a, let's say, a negative reaction or viewpoint of modernity, but modernity still goes on strong. It's just they have some schismatics who have, I guess, poignant criticisms of it, but ultimately don't solve the problem.
Well, it's similar to the Romantics, right? They realized that there was a deep problem with the trajectory of society. It leads ultimately to an inhuman world that deprives the individual of meaning. And the Romantics, starting in Germany, but moving to Russia and to America, the American Romantics were the Transcendentalists. They tried to fight the rise of industrialization, but failed. And in a similar way, the postmoderns are trying to fight the rise or the continued rise of modernity, but also ultimately failing, unfortunately. Right? It's within the postmodern milieu that you get things like Marxism in order to rectify the problems of just rampant quantitative reduction, both in the scientific and in the capitalist worlds, but obviously failing, unfortunately. Same thing, feminism, right, is there to rectify the problems that modernity has imposed upon women. At some point in the turn of the century, in the 1900s, they were giving lobotomies to women, so using modern science in order to ultimately remove the prefrontal cortex capacity of women to render them into malleable housewives that wouldn't complain about the redundant and mindless work that they had to do because their husbands weren't talking to them either. Right, so they had no stimulation at home. They were so frustrated. All they could do was literally turn off their brain with a lobotomy. And then unfortunately that turned into many of these antidepressants. Does the same thing chemically, what the lobotomy did physically. And again, all that is the anti-human trajectory of modernity. And the postmoderns criticizing the rise of modern science, criticizing the psychological industrial complex, criticizing modern gender roles, criticizing the relationship between the laborer and the worker in the modern factories. All that can really only be found these days in leftist postmodern circles. And they talk about how maybe Trump is a postmodern phenomenon because he no longer believes in truth and just projects his own reality, but really Trump is more of a modern phenomenon because he's following the same basic presuppositions of technological progress, capitalist profit motive, etc.
The literature that you have the students read in your course, it all illustrates these philosophical developments in the West in their stories.
Right, and you get an introduction to philosophy in that way, as well as an introduction to the history of the modern West. Right, starting with the Renaissance, where they broke away from their Catholic traditions in order to find an alternative vision of humanity. How that created that was in the Renaissance, right, with Shakespeare. How that created problems in the 1800s that were being responded to by the Romantics, how that led to the disillusion in the modern world where people just resigned themselves to hedonism, as Portrait of Dorian Gray. But then even the hedonism leads you nowhere, and that becomes the nihilism and absurdity in Waiting for Godot.
Understood. All right, so we can move to the second portion of the course, composition. You mentioned it includes argumentation, logic, and grammar. So can you tell us what the significance of grammar is and why the students need to learn it? Why are we teaching seminarians grammar when the students are not ESL? Where's the value?
The ancient liberal arts were constituted by 7 fields. The trivium, 3 of them, and the quadrivium, 4. Right? Together it's 7. And the trivium was the lower level of education, kind of the elementary school education. Quadrivium was secondary school, say high school or early college. And then students would graduate if they were competent enough to higher philosophical fields, Aristotle and Plato. And that was the basis of classical education in the West, both East and the West, until at least the Middle Ages. The West unfortunately lost their classical tradition with the fall of Rome and the multiple sacks of Rome. But in the East, the Byzantium maintained that education system for 1,000 years. Its entire history had never lost the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, 3 fields, are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And the quadrivium are the mathematical sciences, started with arithmetic, geometry, astrology, and music. And so the first 3, the trivium, is what the English class, right, in the composition section tries to emphasize. Right, we do grammar, logic, and rhetoric, starting with the basics of argumentation, right? The basics of logic, which is writing an essay, making sure you have a clear thesis, details to support your thesis, quotes, and analysis. basics of logic in that sense, how to present a position. And then we do basic grammar, which is important just to structure a mind. And even though most students have had grammar classes in elementary school and middle school, not all of them have, unfortunately, right? That becomes the problem too, is that this class is trying to ensure that all the students are at the same level. And some students haven't had a good grammar background or don't know basic grammar structure. So even though they maybe are not ESL, they don't have a reflexive study of grammar. They know how to speak English, they know how to write the way they speak, but they don't know the forms of grammar that help to make their writing as clear as possible. And also some of the rules of grammar are counterintuitive. They don't follow spoken forms that we use daily, right? So it's important to distinguish between oral speech and academic writing, which is rare in schools these days, right? They want their academic writing to assimilate to or approximate oral speech because they think that would be more understandable, easier to digest, things like that. But there was an art to formal writing, to academic writing, and many of those rules haven't been explicitly articulated to the students, even if they've gone through all these grammar classes. So again, forming the foundation, organizing the mind into these patterns, and understanding how from the grammar you build logic ultimately. You have to know how to write a sentence in order to put the sentences together, and logic teaches you how to put sentences together. Grammar teaches you how to put the single sentence together. And then rhetoric teaches you how to do it in a more captivating style. So we talk about different ways of writing that would be appropriate in different environments, right? When you write a sermon, that's a different style of writing than if you're writing an academic essay, which is different than if you're writing on the internet or trying to do a podcast, right? All those styles are going to be different. So part of the rhetoric, and that's composition, right? It's to teach you how to write a sentence that you can organize into a logical flow and progression to develop a point, and that you can do that all as captivating as possible, as beautifully as possible with rhetoric.
So you mentioned earlier, when we were talking about literature, you mentioned humanity, the studies of these themes are part of the humanities. Can you tell me what are the humanities?
It's a range of disciplines that tend to be marginalized from the rest of the universities when they're called humanities, because there are the hard sciences like physics and chemistry, computer science, and those are the ones that are of highest value, and the ones that obviously can make the most money when you come out of college because they are concrete. Those are the hard sciences. The soft sciences are technically not the humanities, but they're the sciences applied to the humanities. So social sciences are considered soft science because they're not as precise as the hard sciences. And those include sociology, anthropology, history, economics. These are all soft sciences. You could still make money coming out of college with it, but not as much as the hard sciences. And the lowest on the totem pole are the humanities themselves because they are not considered sciences at all, in fact, right? They're considered to be merely qualitative rather than quantitative. And originally, right, they were to teach you how to live in the world, right? What is the human-centered perspective? So those kind of classes include music and English, philosophy, women and gender studies, right? All the liberation studies now that they have, Chicana studies, African American studies, all these human-centered studies are marginalized in the humanities, which were, again, supposed to teach you how to live in the world and supposed to complement all the other sciences. Because you can do the hard sciences, which are purely inhuman, purely quantitative. You can try to apply those quantitative principles to human societies in the soft sciences. But in both of the sciences, both the hard sciences and the soft sciences, you can either do them in a human way or in an inhuman way, right? They become like a technology. The technology is not evil in itself, it's how you use it. But without the humanities to complement the sciences, we don't know how actually, what mode in which to use those sciences, right? In which to do the experiments, and what kind of framework within which we can live with the sciences rather than being imposed upon by the sciences. And so the humanities third level should be complementary to the other sciences and should teach a human how to live within the world. And that's why English is so important, because it gives you a sense of both the internal and external dynamics of being a human being in a world. And that's where the literature part of the English class is illustrative of not only the history of literature, but also the history of Western progress, because the characters in the books are navigating the world in which they live and teaching the readers how to do the same. And so it gives them the perspective, an overarching map of a human life in the world, which again you don't get if you're hyper-focused on the sciences, especially on the hard sciences that are purely quantitative. And you get it in a very distorted way in the soft sciences, because the point of the soft sciences are not to be a human, it's to apply the hard sciences to the human condition, like sociology, that turns humans into statistics. But it's only the humanities that are able to somehow still frame a qualitative life for a human and still have that hope. And that's why postmodern philosophy tends to be relegated to the humanities with all their critiques of the other sciences. And instead of being complementary, which it should be, the sciences and the humanities should complement each other, they've become competitive, because the only hope of a career in this world is in the sciences. So the sciences inherently degrade the humanities as being useless, right? What kind of job are you going to get from it, right? That's what you hear every parent tell their child if they want to be an English major. What are you going to do after college? How are you going to make money in this world? And there are ways, it's okay. You're not going to make $1 billion making AI, but is that the best way to live a meaningful life to begin with? We need all kinds of people, though. But again, that's why the humanities are criticized by the hard sciences. The hard sciences have a pretentious, kind of self-righteous pretension against the humanities, because they're the practical fields. But the humanities similarly competes with the sciences with their criticisms of science that becomes even more extreme because of this conflict between the two sides. The more the sciences try to marginalize the humanities has to fight back, right, and go to the extremes, saying things like science is racist, because the only way, right, they can somehow distinguish themselves and elevate themselves over the sciences, which are similarly trying to raise themselves over the humanities. So it just becomes a battle rather than an attempt to find common ground.
So ideally, we would want a symphonia between the two.
Well, there would have to be. One of the main themes in the English class is form and content. Form is the external, you can say the letter. Content is the internal, the spirit. And the sciences might be very good at tracing the external forms of the world and manipulating those external forms. But if you're a pure materialist, a pure quantitative, empirical scientist, you don't believe there's an internal content, right? Everything is just an empty shell of atoms that emerges from the atoms and returns to the atoms. There's no such thing as life, ultimately. There's no such thing as reason. These are all illusions of lifeless atoms interacting with each other. So modern science emphasizes empty form. And so the humanities should be focusing on the content, the internal life of the human, as opposed to the external form of the science. And it does so sometimes, or most of the time, unfortunately, by destroying all the form of science. And so it leads to a kind of chaos of internal, spontaneous expression without any form to direct it and shape it and mold it in a certain direction. So you have excess form with no content in the sciences. You have excess content with almost no form in the humanities because of this conflict, because each side is trying to dominate and demonstrate its supremacy over the other side. But it should be complementary and balanced, because form and content should go together. Right? The form is the externalization. The content is the internal motor for that external formalization.
This is all very relevant, Professor, because if you look at what a seminary is and what it's supposed to produce, here we have a seminary to produce pastors, ideally, or
God willing,
people who contribute their talents to the church. And outside of, I don't know how you classify music. Would you consider music a soft science?
It's also humanities. It's one of the things that can be cut out of the march for efficiency and progress.
Is it because you can't build boots using music?
Right,
That
but you can
thing?
use the AI now to make music for you. So you can remove the human component completely.
I see. So here in the seminary, it's pretty much an education in the humanities in order to prepare someone for the role of a pastor. A very fascinating framework. We're not teaching hard sciences to the seminarians. I don't believe so in any context.
No. But the idea is that, God willing, with the philosophy class, they'll be able to engage with the discourse of science in a way that is balanced, being able to accept science while also realizing the limitations or the problems when science encroaches on all aspects of human life. And so the pastor should be able to have a human-centered perspective, right? Because humans are created in the image and likeness of God. So we are the center of creation, and therefore the humanities, the inner human nature, is what should be nurtured, right, by the pastor first and foremost, and to teach the human, right, the individual parishioners, how to live in the kind of world that we engage with. So the pastor not only has to know theology, which is another humanities, right, removed from the mainline acceptable college curriculum now. He has to know not only the theology, but also philosophy in order to be able to converse with all and persuade all his parishioners about different aspects of human life, right? Not only ethics, but also, right, the way the different parishioners relate to their own employment, right? Businessmen have to have an orthodox philosophy when they enter into business. So the priest has to be the mediator between theology and the business world. The priest also has to be the mediator between theology and the scientific world, and all the arenas in which humans and his parishioners play a role, right? He has to be conversant in politics, economics, contemporary science, etc. And the only way you can do that is through philosophy, because the framework of philosophy organizes all the particular discourses underneath it, which the priest then can apply to his different parishioners, and all the multiplicity and division and diversity. So you should be able to have a conversation about everything with everybody on a deep level, even though it might not be the immediate practical level of the person who actually works in those fields.
So the pastor is forced to be a specialist in the humanities. His primary trade is with people.
That's it, yeah.
If you don't have any people, you're not much of a pastor.
Well, yeah, you have to love people, right? That's number one, right? Christ says, love your neighbors and your enemies. And St. James, I think it's St. James, right, says, if you don't love your neighbor, you don't love God. And so the humanities, right, is the kind of academic door in which you can enter into the human constitution from the inside out. Right? What does it mean to be a human? And what are we supposed to do with our human nature? Which, unfortunately, secular humanities departments don't have that proper framework, and therefore their humanities ends up degrading, right, into whatever postmodern nihilistic hopelessness is available to them. But we have here at the seminary, right, the true anthropology, the true vision of human nature, so we can frame, right, the rest of human endeavors with that definition of humanity, which both men and women share.
It brings up the question of humanism. Typically when someone mentions humanities, we think about the humanism. And previously, I conceived of humanism being a strictly secular endeavor. That's what the impression I get when you walk into a humanities department in a university and it's dedicated to secular humanism. But that's not what's going on in the seminary. Is there a precedent for this in the Orthodox tradition of the brand of humanism, if that's what we're doing here in a seminary in promoting these types of humanities?
Well, it's a good question, because definitely in the conflict between Western Christianity and the Renaissance, humanism was disparaged, right? And it even continues today, right? The modern scientists disparage the humanities. The modern radical right, business-oriented, tech-oriented, they want to kill the humanities, right? It's the same struggle that began in the Renaissance. First with the Western Christians, then morphing into this modern science, and then this capitalist endeavor. But that wasn't always the case, because, again, God created man in his image and likeness, so a study of humanity is not necessarily evil at all, right? Study of humanity is the study of God's greatest creation. So the humanities, in that sense, have always been preserved by Orthodox educational institutions, in Byzantium, for instance. The trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, remember, is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The quadrivium, the mathematical sciences, right? We were fine with math as well, and quantity. That wasn't the problem in Byzantium. It's in the modern world, the problem is when quantity dominates over quality. But the Byzantines knew how to integrate quantity in the quadrivium with, again, arithmetic, geometry, astrology, and music. But that was superseded by qualitative philosophy, right? Aristotle and Plato. So that was the basic humanities education in Byzantium, which was the basic education of really the entire empire, from the lowest free man to the highest emperor. All free citizens of the Byzantine Empire had some kind of literature education. Right? They say that actually at a similar time, right, contemporary with the West, that lost everything after the sack of Rome, including their educational institutions. At the same time, parallel to it, Byzantium had an exceptionally high degree of literacy, where even the lowest classes, who were not slaves, right? They were free citizen farmers. Even they had a basic literature education. They could read the Psalms, for instance. And education actually was a means of social promotion and rising up the social ladder, where if you achieved the humanities education, the trivium, quadrivium, etc., you'd be able to be placed into high levels of the Byzantine bureaucracy. So Byzantium maintained the humanities education, celebrated the human nature, and what's interesting is that the fall of Byzantium in 1453 is actually the cause of the Renaissance in the West, when all the Byzantine humanists and Byzantine philosophers fled Constantinople and moved to the West and brought all the knowledge, and especially the Platonic corpus, into the West. So actually Renaissance humanism began with Orthodox Byzantine philosophers. So Byzantium always had the humanistic education. When it was transferred over to the West, it turned into Renaissance humanism, which was then criticized by Western Christians. So the Western Christians, unfortunately, didn't have the resources in their education system to understand Byzantine humanism in their education system, and created a conflict between Western Christianity and Renaissance humanism that paralleled the conflict prior to that between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. There's a fundamental difference in worldview and the way they frame the human. And I think that's one of the most interesting twists, is that actually Renaissance humanism is a Byzantine phenomenon. And so to reject humanism is also to reject one of the central tenets of Orthodoxy, which, because it was decontextualized from Byzantium and from Orthodoxy in the West, it eventually degraded into the kind of secular humanism that we have today.
That's quite revealing, Professor. So it shows that when you take humanism and humanities out of the Orthodox context, it cannot save man alone. What actually ends up doing is it becomes distorted and bent towards nefarious or misguided ends. We have modernity because the West got their hands on Byzantine humanism and twisted it.
Well, actually, we got modernity because they rejected the Renaissance humanism for the modern science, right? That they believed was more satisfying to them because it was more practical.
So they just threw it out altogether.
Well, and yeah, that's why it's always been on the margins, right? And becoming more and more marginalized, because it was, even from the beginning, seen as, number one, foreign, number two, prevented practical technological advancement, and then now it's seen as just merely hedonistic and narcissistic, because a humanism without God ultimately leads to ultimate pride. And so what is that human going to do? It's probably, unfortunately, going to fall into a life of pleasure seeking for itself. But that's why some of the highest versions of secular humanism are like Marxism or social justice warriors, where they're trying to go beyond themselves and their own self-gratification to build a world where everybody can gratify themselves, right? Because ultimately it's the same presupposition. But nevertheless, there's a kind of altruism in those social justice humanities focus, because they're thinking about more than just themselves. Some of the humanities, unfortunately, falls into the most hedonistic, most pleasure-seeking and narcissistic mentalities, but some actually can try to create a human-centered world for all humans. But still, without God, it becomes distorted, and we don't have the true direction, because even the individual human, right, his end goal is to transcend the world and commune with God, but then also that relates to the way he builds a society, which is also supposed to be a human-centered society that helps all humans do the same thing, ultimately transcend the world and have a relationship with God. So without that framework, the humanities is always going to be limited to worldly concerns.
Yeah, I think that answers all our questions. Thanks, Professor.